We all like different kinds of music, and music is subjective. If the question is, who's your favorite band or artist, there's really no wrong answer, is there? But here's the thing, whatever kind of music you like, it's pretty certain that a city and the culture in that city was critical in developing and producing that music. So today we're counting down the 10 cities worldwide that have produced the most influential music, and it's fascinating because of how non-linear the impact of these cities is. It'll all make sense when we go through it. Coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and, I guess, music this week, although the transportation logistics of concert tours would be a super fascinating video. Viewer-suggested topics are good, but this is an idea that I've had on my list since probably the beginning of the channel. It's always felt a bit out there as a topic, maybe a little bit out of my lane, but occasionally a week comes along where something that's been on my list for like 2 years just finally feels right. And this is different because something that's under-discussed on this channel and in the urbanism discourse broadly is how indispensable cities are in nurturing and developing artists and really culture itself. I'm not talking about technical stuff, although that's important too. You're probably not going to find a good recording studio that isn't in a city. And just as a practical matter, you can't form a band if there aren't other talented, artistic people in close proximity to form a band with. Now, what I'm really talking about is the intermingling of ideas and influences that naturally come from an urban environment. You could even say network effects, and the chance to learn from and be pushed to greater heights by other artists who are competing for the same ears and eyeballs. So as usual, I'm using a top 10 list format as kind of a Trojan horse to talk about ideas that I really want to talk about. This was tough though, because it's really hard to find an objective measure for what constitutes quote-unquote good music. I mean, there's music I think of as objectively terrible that is really popular, and there's music that's obviously great and doesn't sell at all. But the basic idea is I wanted to find a way to assign values to bands and artists and assign them to the city they're most closely associated with, sometimes splitting credit between more than one, so I could generate an aggregate score for each city. And that's what I did, but music really is such a subjective experience. We don't all listen to and appreciate the same things. And maybe you believe the rap rock band 311 is the greatest act in the history of music, and therefore Omaha, Nebraska is the most important city in music history. You're entitled to that, but I'm going to take a more holistic view. This is going to be focused on genres of popular music that arose in the 1950s and 60s and continue to evolve to this day. If you want to go farther back in music history, I'm sure like Vienna and Salzburg are super important, but that's a different video. Data sources, really 3 things. The Rolling Stones' most recent 500 greatest albums list from 2023, and the Pitchfork lists, which rank records within each decade. The combination of these gives a fairly balanced representation of genres, including both huge mega hit records and underappreciated but influential records. And I also wanted to give credit for pure popularity, so this doesn't come off as too elitist. So I gave additional points for records with documented sales of 15 million or more. So this is going to be the 10 cities that have had the most impact on the landscape of modern music as we know it. And as I looked at this, nearly every major city in the world has produced great music of some kind or another, so being in the top 10 is really a high bar. As always, if you don't like the way I did this, start your own YouTube channel. Okay, that's more than enough preamble, so let's get into it. Number 10, Atlanta, a city that I don't think would have been on this list 5 to 10 years ago, and which I expect to continue to grow in importance. I mean, there's always been great music that came out of the state of Georgia, but not necessarily Atlanta itself. Although, if you look back in history, you will find artists from lots of different genres that developed their sound in the greater Atlanta area, who have stood the test of time. In the methodology I used, though, it's really these guys who vault this city into the top 10. Number 9, Houston. And I'm just going to be real, Houston shows up on this list purely because of this person, probably the most important music artist of the last 20 years or so, when you consider both sales and critical acclaim. The city has definitely contributed a lot to the current landscape of popular music, and there's some history here too, if you go back a bit. Number 8, when I originally conceptualized this list, I wanted to highlight cities that have developed multiple big-time, enormously influential artists, and I do eventually get there, but I just don't think there are 10 cities like that. Minneapolis-St. Paul is mainly here because this guy's career was absolutely enormous in every way, and it pretty much all developed in the Twin Cities. Not that the region hasn't produced other great acts, but they just aren't the acts that are going to get Minneapolis-St. Paul in the top 10. Number 7, Seattle. Mostly here because of the cultural impact and sales of this band. I mean, I saw more Nirvana t-shirts when I was overseas in Spain and Portugal last year than basically every other act in music history combined. But there was a whole local ecosystem that fostered the development of all the bands of that vintage, and a record label that's not only continued to grow in influence, but how many indie record labels have a retail outlet at the airport? The city has produced very successful post-grunge bands too, but if you go back further in history, the other huge act that gets Seattle on this list is this guy. And I give Seattle half credit for him because there's no doubt other larger cities were influential in his development, but he learned guitar and started playing in his first bands in Seattle, where he actually attended my middle school and my high school. Not contemporaneous with me. Come on, you guys. Number 6, speaking of cities that have or had an entire local ecosystem organized around a record label, I give you Detroit. Incredible legacy of black music over a number of decades. I mean, like the literal queen of soul, but really tons of Motown artists over the years. The data point most responsible for putting Detroit at number 6 is this guy. Kind of underappreciated, I think. He just put out absolutely incredible records. Detroit had other important bands too, though. This one, really from Ann Arbor, if you want to get technical, but cut their teeth in Detroit and were influenced by this band, really important progenitors of punk rock. The city has continued to give rise to important and wildly popular music in the 2000s too. So we're halfway through this list and you have to be thinking, yeah, the US is incredibly dominant when it comes to popular music. And it's kind of true. If you go overseas, you'll hear two kinds of music playing in coffee shops and bars and restaurants. Obscure seeming, locally popular music in whatever the native language is, and American and British popular music, maybe a little Australian. And on that note, let's go to number 5, Liverpool. Let's be honest, Liverpool shows up here entirely on the strength of one band, which is fine. I mean, probably both the best-selling and most influential music of the last century. It's hard to overstate it. And you can credit some of their development to London and maybe Hamburg, Germany, but they really did come together and come of age in Liverpool itself. And it's really hard to say what the second most important band or artist out of Liverpool is. These guys? Probably. These guys? Probably not, although this is all a bit subjective. This guy? He knew it was coming. Number 4, Chicago. Now we're getting into cities that truly are not dependent on any single artist or record label for their place on this list. Chicago has been a fulcrum of just about every genre of popular music in the Western world. Jazz, blues, soul, rock, house music, hip-hop, and rap. I don't have enough time in this video to show all the important artists from these last 4 cities, but this guy is probably Beyonce's only real challenger for most influential and successful musician of this millennium. And I gotta give the greater Chicagoland area half credit for this guy. If you've been following this index I created, you might say this is all just a function of the size of the city, but it doesn't really play out like that. There are some larger cities that just don't even show up here, which I will address in the honorables and dishonorables. And besides that, the function is clearly nonlinear if you look at the scores. So a lot of this really is about network effects that cities create. Okay, in a minute, I'm gonna get to the top 3, which you should be able to guess. Bonus points if you get them in the right order. And a whole bunch of other cities I'm gonna address too, because this is a topic where I feel like I'm just leaving so much out. But first, brief reminder to engage the screen elements on this video. Hit the bell to be notified when I post to the community, schedule another live stream, whatever. You can find me at all the usual websites and direct support on Patreon, always appreciated. Honorable mentions, New Orleans and the entire Mississippi Delta, so crucial to the development of what we think of today as popular music. And Memphis, and not just because of Elvis. Cities that were in shouting range of Atlanta to get on this list. The Bay Area, you would think has enough firepower, but not the way I did the math. Also, huge penalty for any metro area that produced the song "We Built This City." Philly, just not enough, and I only gave partial credit for Billie Holiday. I just wonder if the close proximity to New York makes it way too easy for anyone with any musical ambition to just pick up and head like 80 miles northeast. Toronto, just not enough, especially considering the size of the city. Although, I guess it depends what you're into. Manchester, tons of great music, just not top 10 by my reckoning. Some smaller cities worth mentioning. Oxford, England, punching way above its weight, including a personal favorite. Reykjavik, also very big in this analysis relative to its size. And I have to give Jacksonville, Florida a mention. Actually some genuinely good stuff, but also probably a high per capita representation of problematic bands. There's really no such thing as a dishonorable here, but places we think of as music cities, like Nashville and Austin, have produced surprisingly few notable acts. Now, they're centers of industry, like if you want to record a country record, Nashville is where you're going to find all the studios and producers and session musicians. But a lot of country acts literally cut their teeth and develop their sound and their style in smaller towns, which I suspect is why that genre of music appeals to people from those places. Number 3, did you guess Los Angeles? It's Los Angeles. Big, incredibly influential acts from basically every decade. The 60s, the 70s, definitely the epicenter of every kind of metal in the 80s. Huge hip-hop scene in the 90s with influences even up to the present day. All kinds of R&B, and I give LA half credit with Chicago for this guy and his sister. Like, I just don't think you can get all the different kinds of music a city like LA produces without all the cultural mixing and competition you get in a city like that. Oh, and I give half credit for this band, and that credit is shared with Number 2, London. When we talk about any of the various British invasions, this is where it's primarily coming from. Recent and contemporary music, punk rock, new wave, progenitors of new wave, split credit with Dublin for this band that put out possibly the greatest record ever made. Things we think of as arena rock, classic rock in spades, easily the dominant force in mainstream rock in the 60s and 70s. Bands that were just so massive and that we'll probably just never stop listening to. And even what I've shown you is just scratching the surface. You know what though? The whole time, this was really just a video about New York and the amazing network and agglomeration effects that happen in cities. If you look at the scores, there actually ended up being a pretty clear definition between the top cities on this list, and again, it's non-linear. For New York, an amazing jazz legacy that really overlapped with the advent of rock music and soul. Not only the birthplace of hip-hop or rap, but produced several acts that define the genre to this day. And what I'm showing you is barely even beginning to give credit for how deep New York's contribution to that genre is. Dance music and R&B, some of the iconic folk and rock acts of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, experimental and noise rock, all kinds of indie rock, and just the mix of punk, art rock, and new wave that came out of the city in the 70s is practically enough all by itself to put it at the top of this list if I was doing it subjectively. But as always, New York is just a smorgasbord of everything. Because yes, my channel is primarily about urban planning and transportation, but urbanism is really about so much more than that. Music and live shows are inseparable from city life for a lot of people, and I don't personally go to as many shows as I used to, but I love that I can watch a documentary and learn more about music subgenres and performance art that I kind of knew existed, but really hadn't thought about a whole lot. So there's a documentary from BlueSky called Danger Music that talks about and includes footage from this particular subgenre where if you go to a performance, you should really plan on getting psychologically and potentially physically harmed. Full disclosure, some of what's in the video is at least mildly disgusting. It's definitely genuinely disturbing, and it simply wouldn't fly on the usual video sharing platform, which is lucky because Danger Music is a Nebula original and exclusive to the platform, and it's an amazing example of how Nebula supports its creators creators in producing and publishing content that's not just edgy, but allows a creator to tell stories the way they want to tell them, even if the subject matter is kind of tricky. Being part of the Nebula community of creators has been just massive for the growth of my channel and improving how I do what I do, not to mention it's a great platform for my content. And remember, Nebula is a streaming service that's owned by us, the creators, so when you sign up, you're helping us grow a platform that supports all of us in a long-term, structural way, financially, professionally, and creatively. So if you want to support this channel's ability to continue to grow, reach more people, and tackle more ambitious content, signing up for Nebula is a really great way to do that. Also, if you haven't noticed, this year my videos are going up several days early on Nebula, so if you want to move your viewing schedule up and avoid spoilers, a Nebula membership is a pretty cost-effective way to do that. Because if you use my custom link down in the description, it really is an amazing deal. You get all the Nebula content for just $250 a month, which is 40% off the usual price, and the lifetime offer is still available. $300, you pay once, and you get Nebula for as long as both you and Nebula exist. It's an amazing way to support the platform and fund an ever-growing slate of cool Nebula originals, which I'm actually getting ready to pitch, kind of an ambitious one, so wish me luck. And for all of you who are already Nebula members, just a massive thanks from me. Although you should probably be watching this video on Nebula where it appears ad-free and without this promo section in it. Just putting that out there. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining, and thanks as always to the patrons for helping keep things running smoothly and giving me the leeway to keep trying different stuff. I'll definitely be interested in seeing the response to this one because I really do think there are so many things about cities that we do take for granted, and I'd love to talk more about those things. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.